All right, guys. So that was bad, but we're gonna keep it. I'm super pumped up about the guest today. It's because I'm thinking about our last name because I've been thinking about it all morning. So Paige Dimakos, and she's the CEO of the Draft Network. So Paige, I'm super pumped up because I think you have a really cool just journey and building the Draft Network into what it is today. But then also, I'm going to pick your brain about Justin Fields. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, love that saying my name correctly made you so nervous that you fudged the top. Love that.
Yeah.
Was
You
perfect,
know,
perfect, perfect way to start this podcast off. Like I love
I,
dedication to getting it right.
I think it's good, right? Everyone who listens to my breakdowns or this knows that I'm absolutely brutal, anyways, with a lot of just words in general. So it was good to, no, I've had a lot of interesting last names, and I don't know. Someone said Jenkins the other day and pronounced it weird, and I was like, I'm never going to do that to somebody. So now I got to
You have a
prep.
pretty easy last name too. Like it's hard. My favorite with my last name is that people add R's in routinely. Like it's
Okay.
Demarcos, and I look and I'm like just a little confused with where we're getting this. There's no R. As you said, you were getting ready, you're listening to some of my appearances, and I can guarantee you that you were correct. That probably if you listen to 50 appearances, 25 of them had like some different variation of my last name. So well
Yeah,
done. Hit it
I'm
out
not
of the
gonna lie.
park.
It was pretty brutal because I'm like writing down all the different ones. And then I'm getting other people to listen. They're like, hey man, I gotta actually do some work. I'm like, no, but I need you to listen to
Yeah.
this and tell me what the pronunciation is. So no, it was good. But I mean, for the people that maybe are just more like love the X's and O's side of stuff, talk to everybody about one, the Draft Network, what it is today, but then
Yeah.
I mean, tell us a little bit about your journey and how you built it to where it's at.
Yeah, I think, Draft Network is, one of a kind in the sports media landscape. And I came into it after it had already started and had its infancy. And I kind of came in, was the organizer. I structured it. I came from a more traditional sports media background where a lot of the guys that are a part of the team came from NDT Scouting, which Kyle Crabb started many years ago. And he and I had worked together at FanRag Sports, and so we had a level of trust with each other. So there was a lot of understanding of like, he understands the football acumen and the scouting part of it. And then I knew the content side and the social media side and the digital side. So there's a nice partnership that exists there between myself and really the whole team. And it's only just grown so much since I first came in. And the last year to be able to grow, to be able to add to the team in spite of us being in a year where we didn't know we were going to get football in general. At part of the year, we didn't get a full college football season for obvious reasons. The NFL was up in the air. I was holding my breath week to week, just saying like, please no bad COVID tests. Like just get us
Yeah.
through this season, knowing that it wasn't going to be the best version of what we had. So the fact that we continue to grow, continue to grow our podcast, our user base, our everything we added to the team feels like a huge win. Like that in and of itself feels like a huge win because man, 2020 and the first quarter of 2021 was tough for a lot of people. So to be able to have a positive message coming out of it, I think is pretty unique, and it's something I'm really proud of the team for. Really, really proud of the team.
What was your guys' biggest challenge? Because I do find it interesting. Like every business person you talk to, it was something different. Were you guys already pretty virtual in terms of the way you guys met and did everything, or was that a challenge? Kind of, what was your guys' just biggest business challenge, kind of for 2020 or throughout all of it? I guess.
Yeah, I think that's where we had a leg up because we are a virtual company. We've got people all over the country already, and we're set up digitally that way. So we already knew how to operate on Zoom, right? We already knew how to do a lot of that. So that was something we were set up for. Whereas a lot of other companies were adjusting to, a brick and mortar, and they had to figure out how to go behind the scenes or how to, teach a lot of people that are older technology, how to use it. So for us, that wasn't the case. So for us, that did put us in a better position to not have to do as much adjusting. I'd say the biggest challenge for us is that everything was out of our control, right? And that's a tough thing for business, is because myself as a CEO, I'm going to talk to partners and saying, okay, we're going to be able to do this, 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 and this. Well, it's really hard to promise things when if there was no NFL season, I couldn't promise anything, Tim, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, you can't, yeah. And obviously, I had no control over that. And as somebody who, is in a leadership position, it's very hard to feel like you're completely out of control, right? When you're running your business. And so that was definitely the biggest challenge. But that also led, I think, myself and the team to just kind of have this, like, I don't want to say woosah, but yeah, it's like a little like deep breath and like, you know what? We can only focus on what we can control. So it was like from the very beginning, I remember we left the combine in 2020. The team just absolutely crushed. We were coming out feeling a high. That March, that like a week and a half later, the Rudy Gobert stuff happens. The whole world changes. Everything shuts down. And I can remember talking to the team and just saying, listen, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're going full steam ahead. Like, we're going to operate normally. We're going to, and look what happened. It was the biggest free agency year. Tom Brady left New England, right? I mean, it was the biggest. Phillip Rivers, all these massive moves and changes happened. And then on top of that, it was the most watched draft ever. Like, it was an unbelievable virtual draft. So it ended up, I think the messaging, if you want to take something away from, the last 2-minute tangent that I was on, I think you control what you can control, right? And you focus on what you have in your lane. And when you focus on that, you largely will have success, because if you're trying to figure out what everybody else is doing, or you're trying to focus on things that you don't have any control over, man, it's going to be very frustrating for you. Very frustrating.
I think it's so funny because everyone like remembers where they were at, like when everything first started. You were saying breaking the combine. We had a bunch of college kids in town training because they all come for spring break. And I'll never forget, we're sitting in the meeting room and like everyone's phone starts lighting up and it's their president saying like, don't come back to campus. That's when I was like, oh gosh, there's something real going on. I think, I sometimes have my head so far in the sand that like I have no idea what's going on. And then all of a sudden it's like everything changed. That was pretty interesting. I do think that you probably went through it too, though. You feel an added level of pressure with everything because there are people that it's their job, right? And you feel like if I make a bad decision, like
100%
everyone's life. So I'm sure you probably had your good and bad days throughout that from that perspective. I know you're a huge Bears.
I was going to say, it's definitely been stressful, largely. Like, do not get into leadership if you are not able to handle stress well, because especially as an empathetic person, like, I felt everything for the team, right? And you largely feel responsible, and you are responsible. Like, you go left when you should go right, and it doesn't just impact you, it impacts everybody else, right? And that's it's a lot of responsibility. I like that responsibility. I think it forces me to work harder, to be more focused, to challenge myself. But I can't imagine in my future life, and I know in my past years, that I could ever have faced any more difficulty and challenges than I have in the last year.
It was crazy too, because I've told everybody, like, listen, we have a plan if there's a real recession. Nobody had a plan for like the world shuts down.
No.
Like, there's different ways you can do certain things, but I mean, it was wild. You're in Arizona, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm in Scottsdale.
What's crazy is we have a location in Houston and we have one in Scottsdale. What was so funny navigating this whole thing from like an on-field training perspective was everything so different. Like, I don't think anything ever happened in Houston. Like, our Houston location was good to go. And then like Colorado, it was just, that was tough to navigate. You have everybody virtual, so you're probably trying to figure out who could do what. And
100%. That was the other tough part, is like, if you were, for instance, I have family, I'm from Chicago, I have a ton of family, my mom lives back there, and then Jamie Eisner, who's the managing editor, he moved to Chicago right ahead of kind of all this happening. He and I were living in different worlds. Like, Arizona for the first part of COVID, the first few months, it wasn't nearly as bad in Arizona as it was in New York and it was in Chicago. And I think, there's different reasons. I think largely when you look at the flu season in general, if you mirror that, it doesn't affect Arizona in the same way because of weather for obvious reasons. And then you think about New York and Chicago being all stacked on each other, right? There's just so many millions of people living on top of each other. Arizona's not like that. It's very spread out. Everybody pretty much lives in a home. There's not high rises. Too damn hot here, right? Can't have high rises when it's 100 degrees. So that was another dynamic, because you're like, okay, so I'm living under these rules. You're living under these rules. And so for me, I think I just kind of made a decision right off the top that, like, we're going to live off of the most strict rules, because if that's what 50% of the team has to do, then the other part of the team has to do it too. Because otherwise it was too hard to try and navigate what Minneapolis and Chicago and New York. It's like, no, we're going to live under the strictest rules until otherwise. And, luckily for me, I have a really amazing team, and they all are very, very health conscious, made sure they took care of themselves, and made sure that they just, kind of focused on, like, let's just focus on growing the company over the last year. And it worked out for us for sure. So
it's been incredible. I mean, the amount of time, again, I'm terrible at navigating social media, but like, I feel like someone on your team is always at the top of my feed. So whatever you guys have done with Twitter, you're doing a great job. So I know you're a huge Bears fan. You hinted at it. Your background, pretty epic. Yeah. You're showing me some new gear that you got. So I know you're juiced up. Talk to me about, okay, well, so one, walk me through from a Bears fan perspective, because I thought this was hilarious on Twitter, of, hey, you would get Andy Dalton, right? Because I can't imagine that was like, that probably wasn't the greatest feeling, right? It's like, my buddies who are in their, early 40s and like, yeah, I guess I'll settle and go with her. But like, I can't imagine that Andy Dalton was the most exciting, like, the signing, right?
Sure.
And then obviously you get Justin Fields. But start with us just as a fan. What was that like when Chicago announced, hey, we're going Andy Dalton?
Okay, so let's start with, it would not been as bad to get Andy if you didn't think you were getting Russell Wilson. Okay, so this is where Bears fans went wrong. Okay, and I, myself included, I stayed out of it as long as I could. I was like, I'm not buying into this. I'm not buying into this. I'm not buying into this. And then he released his teams, and Chicago's on the list, and I'm like, okay, I at least have to kind of 10% of me buy in. Then it's like, Sierra posts some pretty epic Instagram stuff, and then you're like reading between the lines, and then I'm like fully on the internet, just like, yes, I'm dialing into Russell Wilson coming to my football team, right? And then I'm talking to people at the Bears, and I'm hearing the legitimate offers that, like, quite frankly, as a Bears fan, it made me a little uncomfortable, like how much they were willing to give up to get Russ. And every time I would verbalize that to the staff, they just like, shut up, it's Russell Wilson. Like, you just do it, right? Like, you just do it. You live with the picks and the players, and you stop saying, like, you love Roquan and Khalil, and you just go, buy defense. It doesn't matter. We need a quarterback, right? So that's why the Andy Dalton signing, like, quite frankly, Andy's probably the most accomplished, best quarterback that the Bears have ever had. Like, by wins, by the play he's had, by the, he had an MVP caliber season that year when him and Carson Palmer were going back to back, and then Cam Newton won it. Andy's a hell of a football player. He's just not Russell Wilson, and he's an older guy. He's in the back half of his career, right? Like, that's what felt, and he's also like genuinely one of the best human beings, which sucks because it was like all these people being nasty to him, and I wanted to be like, it is not his fault. Like, it's not his fault that we thought we were getting Russ, and then you got Andy, right? So I think that was the first part of the roller coaster, right? So then I just bought into like, all right, Andy's going to be the guy. They're going to do basically what they did last year, right? Where you're like good enough to make the playoffs, but you're not good enough to compete. And I can tell you this, and you will laugh, and people that are listening to this will laugh. In last year, in the summertime, right? Robert Juden, who's my director of marketing, made a graphic that has now been released on the Draft Network. And it was a Justin Fields jersey swap. It is so beautiful. It's epic. It's got the back, Chicago in the background. And I told him, I was like, there is no chance the Bears are going to be bad enough that they can draft Justin Fields, which I am still true. That is still accurate. The Bears were not bad enough to be in a position. They had to trade up. And when it happened, if you were watching our live stream, you watched me interrupt the whole live stream, run out, grab one of these Justin Fields cards, right? But like a life-size one. And I'm like, oh my God, the Bears are trading up to get Justin Fields. And it feels like an out-of-body experience. Like, you went from maybe Russell Wilson to, oh my God, Andy Dalton to, oh my God, top of the mountain, Justin Fields. Like there's no player the Bears have ever had as one of the longest franchises in the NFL at the quarterback position that has as much potential, is the right word, as Justin Fields. And that is, it's exciting. Heart's racing a little bit. Tim, I'm excited, man.
I did a breakdown on him, and I was trying to compare and contrast like a little bit of what Ohio State did and then see what Nagy's doing. There's actually a lot of stuff in common too. So I don't think it's that big of a jump. And I think the kid was doing a lot at Ohio State. I just think, unfortunately, that staff wasn't really turning him free, which ultimately I think is why he fell to 11, right? If he's, I was talking to Jordan Reed about this. I think if he's at Texas A&M, I legitimately think the kid could be QB1 because if you give him just the pro style concepts, people are more comfortable when they watch the tape. Ohio State is just like Star Wars, but they're better than everybody else. So it's fun. So
it's interesting to watch. Like Draft Network's QB2 officially was Justin Fields. So as a value point, I was very happy. It was like, okay, we look at the value. You look at how much San Francisco gave up to move up to get Trey Lance, and then you look at the comparison of what Ryan Pace was able to facilitate by waiting and moving up and getting Justin Fields. So there's a lot of excitement. And I think, there's a lens that people look at quarterbacks. And I love this discussion. I love talking about quarterbacks because the roller coaster that we ride with the whole draft class, right, is amazing. Yeah. It's fantastic. I love we're going to poke holes at stuff that doesn't even make sense. We're going to fabricate storylines. We're going to make, it's hilarious. It's the most dramatic version of sports that exists is watching this whole dynamic happen. And the thing that I said from the very beginning with Justin is a lot of the projecting that was happening was based off of Cardell Jones and Dwayne Haskins. And those guys were not the player Justin Fields was in college and did not have the longevity of what Justin Fields had in college. 2, they were playing under a different coach. And 3, you cannot just put a scope of you went to Ohio State, so you must be this type of player. Yeah. That's not a fair assessment of a guy. And it felt, luckily for me, thank you media. Thank you media. Yeah. Thank you everybody. I'm glad you guys ran with it because otherwise there's no way Justin Fields falls and the Bears are able to get him at 11.
I think a lot of people tend to hold, if you have a lot of talent around you, they tend to hold that against you as a quarterback. But I mean, every guy who's ever been successful, whether in the NFL or in college, obviously had a ton of people around him. It's hard to throw to yourself and protect yourself. So
I mean, Patrick Mahomes needed a better offensive lineman in the Super Bowl. Do we not all remember? I mean, it's like the argument doesn't make any sense. Trevor Lawrence has played with unbelievable guys. Mac Jones played with 4 first-round wide receivers. Like over the last 2 years, like between him and Tua, like you look at that offense and you're like, wow, I mean, geez, between those 4 receivers and the running backs, you're like, man, you could argue it's better than an NFL offense. Like it's unbelievable. And it's interesting who gets the break and who doesn't. And for whatever, as I said, it's very dramatic.
I think the guy in this draft who had the biggest talent spread week in and week out was Trey Lance.
Yeah.
Like North Dakota State, when you watch their film, they look like an FBS team playing a bunch of FCS schools. So it's, that's one of the things where it's hard because Justin Fields is going against, he's going against Big Ten DBs.
Yeah.
It's not like it's one of those things. It is hard. And it's the dumbest thing ever because Mahomes, if you traded Mahomes and Sam Darnold, I really think if Sam goes to Kansas City out of the draft, I just think he looks, or we think of him differently. So
100%. When you look at
2021 quarterbacks, who do you kind of, I know you like Justin Fields in Chicago. If we take that out of it, who do you like from a landing spot perspective? Who are you kind of most excited to see what shakes out? Like, where's your head at with all those guys?
I think it's the guy you just mentioned. I really like Trey Lance going to San Francisco because I like everything else, right? And that's largely what happens when, for whatever reason, we don't want to have this discussion. And it's the discussion that matters. And it's what kind of organization, what kind of coaching staff, what kind of pieces are there for these players when they get there. And largely when you are drafting 1 or 2, you don't really have a great roster. The thing with San Francisco was, yes, they were drafting high. They had to move up, right, to get into that third spot. And a lot of the issues that they had this past year was because they were decimated from an injury perspective. So they come back. They're the Super Bowl caliber roster from a health perspective that they were a season and a half ago. And you allow Trey Lance to have some time to develop, which I think was the best case scenario for him. And Jimmy G knows the writing's on the wall. This is not going to be Jimmy G's team long term. We know what his upside is, which is why anybody that was logical should have never bought into them ever drafting Mac Jones, because what did Mac Jones do that Jimmy G didn't? It's not that, like, I looked at it and I went, no, like Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch did not give up all those picks to go draft Mac Jones. It's just not happening. And I think that's where I look at this at the Trey Lance situation. And I would argue, if I'm trusting anybody offensively in the league, it's Kyle Shanahan. Like, I'll put him with anybody in the league as far as my trust factor. And I think he's going to make guys that walk off the practice squad look like top tier running backs. And he's going to dial it up and mix it up and put some stuff on tape that we haven't seen. And I think that's the best case scenario here for Trey Lance, who's also very motivated. Much like you've heard Justin Fields, like Trevor telling me he doesn't have a chip on his shoulder. Don't love that. Like, don't really love that. Like, you know who's got a chip on his shoulder and has had it for 20 years? Tom Brady. It's worked out pretty well for him. Like, kind of gotta have a little bit of that edge when you play any sport, really, but especially when you're a quarterback in the NFL. And man, it's not that I think Trevor's gonna, not have success. I just haven't loved everything that's happened thus far for that situation. So I'm really dialing into Trey Lance in San Francisco.
I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's such a cool debate about Trey and what you should do with him, because this is so unprecedented. Because we've never had a situation where if I sit a rookie, he hasn't played competitive football for basically 2.5 years.
Yeah,
it's because we've never had this before. And then I was listening to this guy. We were talking, and he was making the argument, what if COVID was the best thing to happen to Trey? He was like, what if, this game this year would have been the whole season? You would have talked about him as the 3rd overall pick. So it's interesting. Obviously, I think San Francisco is going to, if you trade up and give up everything, you have a plan. You know exactly what you want to see from him. Hey, this is when we're going to turn him free. So it'll be interesting. I don't think, it's going to be really fascinating, because if Jimmy G comes out and plays well, I think best case scenario for San Fran is you get Jimmy G to play well in the first 4 and you deal him before the trade deadline.
100%.
I would guess that's the best case scenario.
Yeah, I think that's the best case scenario plan, right? In their head, they're hoping let's call it a New England, a potential trade partner, right? Is trying to make this Cam thing work again, and it's not working, which I think is largely probably what's going to happen. And they either haven't seen what they want to see from Mac Jones yet, or they, have seen what Mac has and they don't love it. And Bill Belichick doesn't like losing. And I don't think they're going to have another season like they did last year. I don't think that's acceptable for that organization and that franchise. And so I think that's a scenario where you go, okay, does Jimmy go out and ball for the first, 4 games and then they are able to make that move? That's best case scenario, right? For Jimmy, for the Niners, for everybody. Yeah,
it's best case for the Niners. It's almost worst case scenario for Trey Lance. If they were all of a sudden like 4-1 and they trade Jimmy, it's like, win.
It's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure for Trey Lance. I want for him to have the best opportunity to have success. Yeah. He's a great kid. Probably one of my favorite interviews I've ever done. Like, love talking to him after the draft. He just had this like electric smile on his face. Like he looked like he was just so happy to be playing football, so happy to be in that situation. Very, I'm so blessed to be with, and I'm like, dude, you're with Kyle Shanahan. Like, if I was picking anybody, like that's what I want to do. And he started laughing and I'm like, that's the truth. Like, you're going to have every opportunity to get yourself in a position to win. And I think that was by far and away, I soft circled like best case scenario for Trey. He goes somewhere, he doesn't have to play right away. He's with a really good coach on a really good roster. And there's not many of those situations.
No, Not at all, especially like you're talking about. If someone trades up to get you, it's way better than if, hey, they're sitting there at 1 or 2. You talked about Trevor, and that's fair. And I think it's hard sometimes to project these guys where you don't really know the system yet.
Yeah.
You could say, hey, I think it's going to be shoddy stuff from Seattle in the pass game, but it's tough to actually say. What about, and again, I know it's a new staff. What'd you think of Wilson with New York? What'd you just think in general of, hey, his rise? And then 2, how does he fit there? What's kind of, because I mean, listen, I'm gonna be brutally honest. I couldn't even tell you who else is on roster for the Jets at quarterback. So I think that's pretty clear cut for him. What do you look at when you see that situation? How do you see the fit, or just in general, what are your thoughts about the Jets?
Yeah, I think the problem with the Jets is that the roster just needs so much, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I looked at pre-trading Sam Darnold, and I thought, and I have a very good friend who is on the staff over at Draft Network, who's a New Yorker and a die-hard Jets guy, right? And I told him, I said, listen, Chris, in the real world, right, and I get the pressure in New York is not going to allow for this, but the smart thing to do would be to get a king's ransom for the second overall
trade
pick.
Out of there.
Trade out of 2, stack your roster, stack the next 2 years with draft picks, turn this thing around quickly, manage the time with Sam, and actually give him a fair shot and a fair opportunity to play and to win. Or if you look at a bunch of scenarios that played out this year, they probably could have put themselves in a position where they did trade back and get a king's ransom, like i.e. with San Francisco, and they moved back enough and they still got one of the top guys that would have been available. And I just think when you look at, like we were talking about earlier, so much of this with what happens with these young quarterbacks is, are they forced to be the guy right away, right? He's going to be the guy right away. He was not drafted to be a backup. He's drafted to start now. Is this team a quarterback away from competing? The answer is no. And that is a problem, because when you're forcing a rookie to go out there and be the guy, and the roster is not a quarterback away, you have a problem. And that's where New York is. And I don't think this is going to be the best situation. I also do think from a culture fit, going from BYU to New York is a huge difference. And you have already seen the laser focus on his family and the discussions and all that stuff. And I hate that plays a part, but it does. It's the toughest place to play. It is the most difficult media area you're going to deal with. And your parents and your family and every girl you talk to and every friend you've ever had, that everybody in New York is going to know them, and it's going to be tough to deal with. And I don't know that he's going to deal with it. I hope that he has. I want every prospect to have success. I want them all to be successful. I want them all. Now, that's not reality. And if I was going to choose of the Trevor, Zach, Justin, Trey, who's the most likely to fail, I think it's very glaringly obvious that it's Zach, and it has less to do with him and way more to do with the team around him.
I don't know what you're talking about, because every time I've tweeted about the Jets, people are really calm and super nice to me, you know? So I don't know what you're talking about at all. Yeah. I did a little Sam Darnold deal about, like, hey, here's the case to be made on how the guy could still play. And the DMs were tough.
Tim, I need you to know there is something that, if you don't already know this, my nickname is Petty Paige. Okay. It was given to me a long time ago by my old radio host, Bertram Berry, here in Arizona. And there is one thing that I am now rooting for, since I did a video for Fox where I was talking about Sam and how I thought he could have success in Carolina. And Jets fans thought it would be fun to come scream at me and yell at me. And I was like, didn't say anything about your team. I'm not talking about your team. I'm just talking about Carolina and Sam. So now they have put me in this position where I want to be petty. So what I'm rooting for is I want Sam to have high-level success. And I want the Jets to be a disaster this year, because that will give me so much joy to watch the chaos of New York on social media just losing their minds, going, we should have had Sam. We could, because it's always coulda, woulda, shoulda. And, you know,
it is tough. I mean,
it's how it is.
Social media is not fun. I said something about Justin Fields and everyone was like, you're not welcome in Columbus. I was like, I wasn't planning on going. Like I'm not an Ohio guy. So that was, yeah, it was tough. So let's shift away from the rookies, and then I will let you go. What do you think from a QB perspective, guys coming back? Who's ready to make that jump? I mean, you talked about Sam a little bit. Who is someone that you're saying, okay, listen, I know here's been his past, but I think he can take that step to be kind of a top tier quarterback in the NFL. You could, I mean, go with whoever you're feeling.
Yeah, I think it's who I saw your question and I'm posing it in a similar lens, and it is to
Yeah.
me who is put in the position to take the next step, and if he
Yep.
doesn't, the conversation around him is going to change, and that's Kyler Murray. I think Kyler
Oh,
Murray at
interesting.
the halfway point, and that's maybe because I'm here in Arizona, but halfway point of last season, he's in the MVP conversation with Russell Wilson,
Yeah.
right? Then the back half of the year, Kyler wasn't great. The team wasn't great. It was largely a disappointment. They miss out on the postseason. You look at the division as a whole. The Rams go out and get Matthew Stafford. I think that's a massive upgrade at the quarterback position for a team that has owned Arizona in the division. Russell Wilson still in Seattle. They have won and owned this division for largely most of the time in the last decade. So now you're looking at the team, and all of a sudden you look at San Francisco and you go, okay, that team is going to be better than they were last year. They got a rookie quarterback who we're TBD on, but we know what Jimmy G is when he plays at a high level, and we know what that roster looks like when it's healthy. All of a sudden, I have a case to be made that they're the fourth best team in the division, right? And I like a lot of what they've done. I do like some of the things they did, but I didn't like their first round draft pick. I don't like what they did there. It's another time where I'm looking and I'm going, okay, we're drafting another linebacker that doesn't play in the system, and you're looking and you're going, I don't love what's happening, and I don't love not getting a couple of these top offensive tackles, offensive linemen to protect a very small quarterback. And it's just how it is. And I think you're playing with fire, not addressing that aspect. And they've added offensively, but you add an AJ Green who, okay, yeah, he's been great at times, but he's older and he obviously has had some injury history. And they've added James Conner, and they've done some things, obviously get JJ Watt. But I look at this division and I look at it's year 3, right? And you look with Kyler and you go, okay, is this team, if they don't make the postseason this year, is Cliff still the coach coming back the next season? And I don't think so. I think the answer is no, because you have to look at this situation and you say, okay, they drafted Josh Rosen and punted on him the very next year, right? They just went, we don't care. We don't care that he was a top 15 pick. We're washing it clean. We're letting Cliff go get his guy. And to me, if you allow for that to happen, if you can't in 3 years have a winning season, if you can't in 3 years make a postseason where they've added a playoff team in the last 2 years, that's a problem for me. I don't think, and I don't have a lot of faith in Cliff. I don't think he's the guy. I think Kyler is going to be and can be a really, really good quarterback, but he's the one where I look and go, okay, can you build off of the first half of the season, or are we going to see largely what we saw in the second half? And is Cliff going to do what he needs to do to be a better coach this year to compete? And I don't know the answer to that.
It's really interesting, too, what you talk about with Kyler, because the thing is if they move on from Cliff, Kyler really is – there's not a lot of coaches who would, really love to take him on. And I say that because he plays so off schedule, and there's certain looks where it's like this, hey, we're not going to take a shot here, and he takes the shot. So there's a lot – but I think I think Cliff enjoys that. I think Cliff likes a guy that plays off schedule. I think he likes, hey, let's be aggressive and hunt even in maybe looks that aren't great. So that's where it's a weird dynamic because they're almost both built for each other. And if one's not there, I don't think the trade value, listen, Kyler would still command a decent, in a trade situation. But to me, it's not the same because I think there's a lot of offensive coordinators who look at it and say, listen, I get how the kid's great. He's just not for us.
Yeah.
And that's where those guys who are off schedule, even Russell, I think the reason his trade value is so high right now is if you look at his game and let's call it the last 2 years, it's so drastically different in terms of playing on schedule than it was at the beginning. And I think that's why his trade value is so high. Now everyone wants him.
Yeah, of
Because they've
course.
seen both aspects. So that's interesting. That's a good one. I haven't heard Kyler yet. I like that.
Yeah.
That's great.
I think he's got a lot to prove, man. I think this is, I know what the Valley's discussion looks like. I know there's a lot of excitement with how the offseason played out. And I just look at this division and you go, who is a weak team? Nobody.
Yeah.
That's a really tough division. And yes, could 3 teams from the West make it to the playoffs? Sure. But it could be 3 teams and Arizona's not one of them. And to me, I look at this and I go, yeah, Sean McVay, Pete Carroll, Kyle Shanahan, much stronger coaches than Cliff Kingsbury. Huge. It is a massive difference. And you see it on the field. And we'll see how it all works out.
A lot of swag from Cliff, though. Great pad too. Big fan of his house.
Listen, he a lot of swag. But this is our Jake Arians and I on our podcast. We have this because BA is the ultimate swag king. Okay, so Cliff's just trying to keep up with BA, who's been doing it for forever, right? And just has natural swag. He's not trying.
Hat game.
It's just
hat game's unreal.
Yeah, and it's just a thing he started doing, and everybody's like, "Oh, that's cool," and he's like, "Well, I've been doing this for a long time, right?" Like it's just like naturally became like this thing. But he and we talked about it with Baker Mayfield, and Baker did everything I asked him to do this year, and that was, you can't have the swag before you have the substance. You got to go show me the substance. It's not the sexy stuff; it's the meat and potatoes, and it gets it done. And once you get there, once you start doing that stuff, then you can give me the swag, but you got to have the substance before you have the swag. And largely, Cliff and Kyler are a whole lot of swag and not a lot of substance. And that doesn't get you a whole lot in the NFL.
Well, that's the air raid. Air raid basically got rid of all substance, and we're gonna launch it down the field. But
you said it.
You never know.
It's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Paige, I appreciate you. This was a blast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Tim.